Hoffert, and Aura. Paul.
All singing. What did you expect? The sage on the stage? We're in an interactive age, and now we have guides on the side, and you're expected to do something too, but we are all together now. A few years ago, I was in the Czech Republic conducting some orchestras for opera music, and I landed in Prague. And I went to the hotel in downtown Prague, and I did my normal shtick. I went to the front desk and I said, I need a room with a data jack, and I have to get online immediately because I can't have the people in Toronto know that I'm actually out of town. I have to do my email and everything and pretend that I'm actually not away having a good time doing music. And for the first time, the clerk looked back at me and said, I'm very sorry, Mr. Hoffert, but a few years ago we had our velvet revolution from the Soviet system. And the dial tones in our country, the entire telephone system, is a relic of that. We haven't changed it, and it doesn't interoperate with the Western dial tones, DTMF. And so I'm afraid we can't accommodate you yet. And in fact, none of the major hotels in Prague can do so. And I said, well, what am I going to do? And they said, well, there's one little business hotel across town, and if you want, we can make a reservation for you there. And they claim to be able to connect you to the internet. And I said, would you mind doing that, please? And the clerk was very polite and said yes. Made me a reservation, took a cab, went across town. And at this other little hotel, I checked in, and within 5 minutes of getting to my room, a nice man came up with a little black box and connected it to my PowerBook, and bingo, I was on the internet. And for the next 7 days, I was able to pretend that I was not away from my office, and went on the internet every morning for about 15 or 20 minutes. And every day for the next 7 days, I took a taxi from my hotel to the recording studio, and we had a nice time with our sessions, and every day I would take a taxi back. And I noticed that although the times that I left my hotel and the recording studio every day were absolutely exactly the same, and although the routes that the taxis took were the same, and although the traffic was the same, the fare for the taxi ride was wildly different. The first day cost, as I recall, about maybe the equivalent of $3 Canadian, and the next day might have been $2, and the day after that maybe $4 or $5. And on my last day in Prague, the driver was trying to charge me $8 for the same ride, and it really bothered me. And I said to him, you know, I'm not going to pay the fare. There's something really weird going on. I take the same road every day, take a different cab, and you guys charge a totally different fare. And he turned around and he said, well, maybe you have a nicer car than the other guys. I said, what difference would that make? He said, well, you know, we've got to figure out how to do it. And I said, no, I checked the taxi meter, and you always charge me exactly what the meter says. And he says, yeah, but of course we all set our meters to what we think the rides are worth. What a concept. And I said, you mean there's no central authority in Prague that makes sure that all the taxi meters are set the same? He said, hell no, that was communism. Now we have free enterprise. We're all together now. Yesterday, Keith Bellows was saying we're all together because we travel everywhere. I don't know, some huge number, $15 trillion of the travel industry or something like that, bringing us all together. Don, could I please have a video from my computer? And Don Tapscott told us that we're all together, we're all on the internet. And Peter Gabriel tells us that we're all together. We listen to world music. But the global village, which a colleague of mine, Marshall McLuhan, coined the term of, doesn't exactly mean that we are all together in an increasingly homogenized world in which globalism and being all together will become the pervasive culture, and localism or local culture will die. Although certainly for the past century, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, that's happened. The bottom line is that we don't care about billions of other people. In our super-connected society, we tend to have associations with about 1,000 people in our lives nowadays, a lot more than we used to. But we only have trusting relationships with the number of people you can count on your fingers and your toes, about 20 people. It's genetically programmed into us. The virtual communities that you and I and millions, soon billions of others inhabit on the internet do not bring the same kind of trusting relationships. We heard this morning from Don McKellar about what happens on the internet and how you can pretend to be somebody else, how you can spoof somebody. When you have those kinds of relationships, it's different than going out and having a beer with somebody and having the relationship develop where you have some trust, or in fact sitting next to a colleague over here and perhaps going out during the intermission and having a conversation. One of the challenges of our age and being all together now is to try to balance the forces of globalism with the forces of localism. I'd like to read you something about the Industrial Revolution. Quote, "The Industrial Revolution has been a disaster for the human race. It has greatly increased the life expectancies of those who live in advanced countries, but has destabilized society and has inflicted severe damage on the natural world." T. Kaczynski. Is there anybody here that recognizes that quote? Okay. Now, the interesting thing is that the actual words that were quoted are taken by most historians of technology as being true, valid, a valid realization. The guy, Ted or Theodore Kaczynski, is a maniacal criminal who's in jail, who killed lots of people and tried to kill more and ended up living in a little shack and was eventually captured by the FBI because he felt that technology, which he broadened to include the new digital technologies, were essentially detrimental to the human race, and therefore something had to be done to stop the spread of technology, to stop the spread of the internet and all of those kinds of things. While it's true that the Industrial Revolution was a disaster in terms of socialization, the digital age is really quite different. Let me give you a couple of examples. At the core of the particular tools and technologies of the Industrial Revolution were the fact that there were roadways that were built, there were highways that were built, and we as individuals in the societies living through this were able to go to services and products that we had hitherto been unable to go to. What this meant was that workers, mostly blue-collar workers at first, would have to go to where the industrial complexes were, the factories where people worked. And in order to get work, in order to make a living, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, over the last century or so, they would have to leave their local community where they had all their support structures, where the local grocer knew them, and if they were out of work for a little while, they could get credit and all that sort of thing. They would have to either leave, usually the men, at that point, would be leaving their families behind in their local community or eventually bringing them to where the industrial complex was and ripping them out of their social fabric that provided support for them. And then as the Industrial Revolution became a little bit more, gained some more steam, you had even the white-collar workers, the bosses, the salespeople who would get transferred, meet me in St. Louis, basically from one city to another, because branch offices were really an artifact of the fact that there was railways and roadways. And so what would happen is that even relatively affluent people would pull their kids out of school, out of all of their friendships and support groups, and take them away. And it's generally acknowledged that some of the most intractable problems of our age, the decay of inner cities, the decay of families, urban crime, drug abuse, things like that, are artifacts, negative artifacts of industrialization, which of course had a lot of positive things too. Most people associate those same problems with every technology and the coming digital age. I'm here today to share with you some information that researchers, my colleagues and I, and other researchers around the world are finding out that indicates very strongly that the 21st century and the digital revolution and the digital age will have exactly the opposite effect and return us to pre-industrial, more social, more family-oriented, and more local, community-oriented structures. The revolution is dead. Long live the revolution. There are a number of differences fundamentally between the industrial age and the digital age. I've just listed a few of them. Industrial age had mass production. Henry Ford let you buy any color car you wanted so long as it was black. And today we move towards personalized products, just-in-time everything, whatever you want. We're moving from mass marketing to targeted marketing on television with all the specialty channels and eventually internet kind of stuff where people will figure out exactly who you are and what you like and get you your stuff. Moving from mass media, or what we like to think of as asymmetric media of few to many, to symmetric media, in which the people who consume the content can also produce the content and also get it back. We're moving products and services to people instead of people to products and services. What does this mean? It means that more than 50% of all the companies in North America today have telework programs that allow their employees to work part-time at home. It means that if you have a two-spouse family, that each one could perhaps work 2 or 3 days at home and not have to put their kid in daycare, for example. It changes the focus from us going to work to things to bring work and things to us where we are. It's a change from big brother government to personal empowerment. And one of the biggest changes is from information proliferation and the Alvin Toffler kind of future shock that had absolutely no solution if you followed out the trend we were going through, to just-in-time information, to generalization as opposed to specialization. And in terms of where we live and how we're going to live, we are moving from living in cities and suburbs and exurbs, which are absolute artifacts of the Industrial Revolution, which built the railways and the roadways and the airways that define where we live. The invention of the automobile, people thought they were selling a horseless carriage. They didn't think that they were selling a new tool to build a new kind of way to live in a suburb because of the automobile. And just as that was happening, today we have in the 21st century, the new places that we will be living in, I call them Habicons for connected habitats, is probably a better word for it. The new places are artifacts of the digital revolution, which has information roots and a very different kind of connectivity. I've been very fortunate because for the last 8 years I've directed a research center at York University, and I've been able to fool around with and have a lot of fun and do research with my colleagues on a bit of the future of how we're going to live. And one of the things that we did was in 1995 we started a trial, raised a lot of money, $100 million, and we wired 100 homes in Newmarket, Ontario, and gave to people video telephones and educational stuff that they could do on the network, and healthcare, nurse on call, and yes, all of the music on demand. People could program their own radio stations and all that kind of stuff. And we and others around the world have been studying these early little sandboxes of what it might be like to live in communities of the future. I'd like to share just a little bit of that with you. One of the first things we found was that this local versus global thing is actually very important. And that the access to the internet, while it gives you one kind of relationship, is very different than if you have a local community network that is private. Another theme that came up just a little while ago, where there's no spoofing, where people sign their email with their real names, and where people know where the other folks online live because they are their neighbors. I'm just going to give you a little clip of one of those, taking that neighborhood in Newmarket, Ontario, and time doesn't permit to give you a lot of it. We took those families who told us it was the friendliest place they had ever lived, and we thought that we would try to connect them to other urban environments in which they would normally not participate. One of them being the City TV, Bravo, etc., Schmooze Fest at the Toronto Film Festival every September. So one year, in 1997, we connected a bunch of suburban residents in Newmarket, Ontario, with life-size images and everything like that, to the party that was happening in downtown Toronto. And I bought a satellite for the evening, and we also connected to a party in Hollywood, which was thrown by the Consul General of Canada. And of course, we had a conference like this, so we were in a bar in downtown Toronto. And here's a little bit of all together now for what we call the Cyber Soirée.
This is probably the first live coast-to-coast party that's ever been staged purely for the entertainment and gratification of the party-goers. We're going to be going to Newmarket, where a whole new generation of neighborhoods is sprouting out. The very essence of interactive. This neighborhood is completely hardwired. These people can talk to each other on video phones. We're going to see all kinds of stuff like that.
Each of the homes has broadband connectivity, and aside from the technology, it has connected the people together and made them much closer.
All in one neighborhood, and we're all connected, and we all talk to each other on a regular basis.
On the line is a gentleman named Nick DeCapois, who is deaf. He lives just up the street, actually. He's on line now, and they are having a conversation via sign language, which of course is something that, until this technology had existed, could never be done.
How many people are wired in like this, Bob?
Right now, I think we're probably up close to 100 houses at this point.
Anyway, we're really delighted to be here, and it's going to be fun this evening. We're very high-tech. We're all hooked up, absolutely online, ready to go. So we hope it's going to be fun. We may make a little music. My dog, Chance the Wonder Dog, may make an appearance if that's required. And we're glad to be here.
With this society now, everybody's working. It's such a fast pace. You come home from work, you don't have time to socialize. This way, you know, it only takes 10, 15 minutes to socialize. You can get online and you can talk to your neighbors and get updated as to what everybody's doing in the neighborhood.
Thanks for joining our Cyber Soirée, guys. Good night, everybody. Have a great weekend. We'll see you later.
Thank you. This is the Penman House saying good night.
Good night.
Within 2 weeks of moving into the community, one of the messages that was sent on this little, it's called a listserv. It's like an email distribution list. We asked the people, would you mind sharing your email address with your neighbors? Now, most of you probably have email. Most of your neighbors probably have email. You probably never communicate with them because you don't know their email address. It's a very simple thing. In this neighborhood, everybody shared their email address. And so they posted little notes to each other. And one of the first notes said, we're going to have a party next Friday afternoon. We're going to have a barbecue. We'll provide the hot dogs. You guys bring your own drinks. And what happened was that just about everybody in the neighborhood got to know each other. When you think about it, to do that without digital connectivity would have been very, very difficult. You would have had to go and start knocking on everybody's door and saying, do you want to come to a party? But of course, people might not be home. People do shift work. There might be a kid home with instructions, don't answer the door, if it's a stranger, and so on and so forth. And the bottom line is we don't do that. We don't get to know our neighbors. In this neighborhood, after 2 years, some of our researchers from the University of Toronto did a survey, and they found out that the neighbors who were living in our connected community, on average, could recite the names of 26 of their neighbors, as opposed to people who lived a block away in identical kind of housing with identical kind of demographics who could only say the names of 7 or 8 of their neighbors. They knew 3 times more of their neighbors. They had twice as much social interaction, face-to-face, not intermediated, not like our resident was talking about, in the middle of winter, having a little bit of connection on a video telephone, which they did. They had 50% more invites of their neighbors to their homes. And bottom line was, they didn't become the kind of internet zombies that Faith Popcorn predicts that we will be, cocooned in front of a monitor and eschewing face-to-face contact. In fact, pretty well one-for-one, every hour they spent at their terminals was cannibalized from television watching. And in fact, they had more social contact face-to-face when out of the house than ever before. It's not surprising. The reason that you go out to a movie, and Richard, something for you to think about, is that not just that there's a big screen, but basically parents go out to a movie to get away from their kids. And kids go out to a movie to get away from their parents. So it's not just having a big screen at home that's going to make everybody cocoon and stay at home. And that's what we found out. And people have been finding that's out everywhere. Microsoft ran a trial in London, England, about 6 months after us. Found out exactly the same results. In Rankin Inlet, I followed a fact that in our Arctic, there was an Inuit community of 2,000 that that the community got wired in, of course, 2 languages. Their primary language of Inuktitut, and English as a secondary language. And when they communicated on the internet with outsiders, of course, they used English. But within their own community, they did it in their local language. And so there is this balance. People talked about auto mechanics, about babysitters, very different things than they talk about on internet chat groups. The typical postings were, has anybody found a black cat answering to the name of so-and-so? Or I have to drive down to the Hummingbird Center next week. I've never been to downtown Toronto. Can somebody suggest where I should park? Things that were very local in nature, not just global in nature. There was a lot of political action that was enabled by the local network. One of the residents realized that there was no sod on their lawn, and the real estate developer was supposed to have put it in. They posted a message. Does anybody else have in their contract that the sod is supposed to be in by such and such a date? And the next day, the real estate developer got an email attachment with 50 of the 100 families that said, you either put the sod in within the next couple of weeks, or we're going to town council and make sure that you don't get a permit to build the rest of your development. I got a call, of course, from the real estate developer who had put up a lot of money for the trial. But then it took the real estate developer 2 or 3 weeks to figure out that instead of getting their lawyer to send letters to all of these 50 people, and whatever the reason was, that they could use the new communication pipeline and send one email, and whatever the particular reason that the sod hadn't been put in, they could do it once instead of 50 times. But the entire dynamic of the community changed. I like to think of a test that comes from a community that has certainly decided to be more or less bypassed by the Industrial Revolution, and that's the Amish, and they were mentioned just previously. We think of them as a community that essentially does without technology in general and has a particular either religious or community bias against it, but that's not true. A lot of digital researchers have been looking at communities like the Amish and looking into their rejection of technology, and it turns out that they're not really against technology at all. Of course, technology is just the most human of any characteristics. The 2 things that make us human are the ability to communicate complex thoughts and the ability to use tools. So digital connectivity, hey, guess what? It's not anti-human at all. But what they do is they have a test, and their test is, does the technology draw us closer together or does it rip us apart? And originally the Amish, in fact, used automobiles, which now they have the horses and buggies and all those things. And what they found was that those members of the community who were using that new technology of automobiles tended to leave their community and go live in the city where they would drive and see movie theaters and all sorts of stuff. And so the local bishops deemed that the technology did not bring them together, it ripped them apart, and therefore it was banned. There is something to be said for using that test with our own communities. And in fact, if you use that test with the new digital age technologies, you find out that they have the capability of bringing us much closer together than we were before on a family basis, and much closer together than we ever were before in terms of local communities. And I'll give you 2 brief examples, and then we'll get out of here. here's an example of a connected, all-together now dance that I had choreographed. 2 dancers, pas de deux, but in 2 different locations, electronically combined, the dancers being together. I've done a lot of distributed music performance because, as you may know, I come from the cultural industries, or as they say in the United States, the entertainment industries. And so both my rock and roll band and other groups that I've been in, I've dispersed among different geographic locations. In this particular example, we did in 1997. I put together a jazz band. The drummer and the bass player were in Montreal. The saxophone player and the trumpet player were at the Bamboo Club in downtown Toronto. I was at the Bravo Television Studios, and the guitar player was at York University. And although it was tough for us then, we had to play a quarter of a second ahead of what we were hearing coming back from the network because of the latencies. We did it, and a year later, if any of you saw the 1998 Olympics, you might have seen Seiji Ozawa conducting the orchestras and choirs around the world. And that was because the Japanese delegation to our 1997 conference came and thought that the idea we had and the way we did it was so fantastic. They improved the technology a bit, had a bit bigger budget than we had, and in the opening ceremonies did that. Here's this distributed performance among 4 different locations. And I started out with All Together Now, which you may have recognized came from the Beatles' Yellow Submarine movie. And perhaps all you need is love. And folks have been talking about that for the last couple of days. Music, as Christopher Dudney mentioned, is perhaps a universal language. Music is an interesting language because it is understood by everybody and at the same time absolutely untranslatable. I was taken by Alex Garden's observation about the World Wide Web. And at the end of his presentation, he said he had an idea that perhaps the reason that the World Wide Web was so popular was that many of us coming through, my words, Industrial Revolution times and Industrial Age times, have been so starved for face-to-face communication and our inability to connect with our local communities, our families, that the web offers us this wonderful, albeit mediated, opportunity to have some kind of communication. And I'd like to close with coming back to world music, which was one of the things that I spoke about very briefly at the beginning. And I have a colleague, a very good friend of mine who I've had the great fortune to record with, that I've brought to join me here as a special treat to close this session this morning. And I'm going to play this thing over here. It's a musical instrument, sort of half a musical instrument. I used to play the vibraphone. I was a percussionist, and I actually got paid to hit things, which is just unbelievable. And a vibraphone is an instrument that has fans and motors and all kinds of things. And then when I started playing in a rock and roll band, it was too hard to mic. So now I have this thing which has rubber pads that are pressure sensitive. And if you press down on them, they send a digital signal. There's no sound in this at all to some boxes there. And because I used to play vibraphone, I was able to synthesize and manufacture something that sounds very much like the vibraphone that I used to play. And so the combination is, might as well be playing a vibraphone. My friend Aura here, is going to come out, and Aura has been deemed a national treasure by Romania. She's Romanian by birth and currently living in Canada, qualifies for the conference. She's sung with Quincy Jones around the world. She's performed with Duke Ellington at Carnegie Hall, and last year had an audience with the Pope. It's my great pleasure to bring on Aura, who is going to do a little duet with me. Come on. What we're going to do is, let me see, we're going to do an unbelievable quick melody. Richard said, how long do you need? How long do you need? I said, we're going to do this all in 3 minutes. He said, 3 minutes? There you go. In 3 minutes, we're going to give you a complete survey of world music around the world and 3 musical styles, if we can manage to do that. And the theme is, the first one, it's about love. The first one is what happens when you lose love.
Your left.
Lose love. It's a Romanian
chant.
Then we're going to go to a Victor Young song, which is about when you find love.
Yes.
And then we're going to close with some Afro-American music. I think they call it jazz nowadays.
Cine iubește și lasă Dumnezeu să-i dă pedeapsă trâișul șarbelui și pasul gândacului. Beautiful love, you're all a mystery. Beautiful love, what have you done to me? Searching for heaven, depending on you. Beautiful love, will my dream come beautiful ba